Well, good afternoon. Hello. I so hope that you have enjoyed your meals and your time of fellowship. And I want to give a special thank you to the staff here at the Hyatt for preparing and serving such a wonderful meal. Thank you. Well, I am Amanda Tyler. I'm Executive Director of BJC. And how good is it to be together? After 3 long years, we are once again gathered together as faithful advocates for religious freedom for all. 3 years ago, we were in Birmingham, and I was introducing you to the new BJC. A new look, a new website, a new way of communicating in the rapidly changing world around us. But how could we have known just how much our world was about to change? From a global pandemic in 2020 to an insurrection at the Capitol in 2021, to the eroding of our rights at the Supreme Court up to this very morning, we are truly living through a seismic change in our society, including urgent threats to our freedom. To respond to these challenges, I cannot imagine a smarter, more resilient, more creative, more passionate team than the one that we have at BJC, and that I have the honor of leading every day. At BJC, we have the largest team in our history, fighting every day for religious freedom. And here today, we have 11 of our 13 team members: Holly Holman, Charles Watson Jr., Dan Hamill, Jennifer Hawks, Sherilyn Crow-Guy, Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, Danielle Tyler, Josiah Masters, Christine Rigadon, and Julia Bradley. So BJC staff, please stand right now to be recognized for your hard work. And a very special thank you to Danielle, who has coordinated the many details to make this incredible event possible, and to Dan and Julia, also from our development team, who have been instrumental in making today happen. You know, over the last 3 years since we have been together, BJC has organized and led, in partnership with a broad swath of ecumenical support, the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. Thanks. Christians Against Christian Nationalism is a growing movement for Christians and others who want to take a stand against this poisonous ideology and offer an alternative Christian witness for the world. We equip individuals to have the tough but necessary conversations in their communities, churches, and congregations about how Christian nationalism threatens our faith and our country. We've worked with religious and non-religious groups and individuals to draw attention to the urgent threat of Christian nationalism, including how Christian nationalism worked to unite the insurrectionists at the Capitol and intensify their attack on democracy itself. I believe that Christian nationalism is the single biggest threat to religious freedom as we know it today. And that the only way to dismantle it will be a national recommitment to the foundational values of religious freedom for all. Now, we have known for some time now, but this past week has made it clear, We cannot count on the United States Supreme Court to lead us in that national recommitment to religious freedom. Reading the opinions in Carson v. Macon, the school funding case, and Kennedy versus Bremerton, the school prayer case, in quick succession as they were released over the past week, we see that a 6-justice majority of this court has come to view different treatment of religion when it comes to state benefits as per se religious discrimination. They are abandoning long-standing doctrines that have supported the principles of no establishment, that have ensured a government that stays neutral when it comes to religion. These two rulings depart from the American religious tradition in ways, and the American religious freedom tradition, in ways that will harm the religious freedom of public school students and their families, and that could lead to even greater discord over religion and even threaten the system of public education itself. It is natural to be disappointed and even to fall into despair. Over the past few days, over and over, many of you here in this very room and others have asked me, how do we go forward from here? Where do you find hope? Hope, after all, is a core religious value. Well, I find hope in this very room, in the commitment to religious freedom that you are showing here today and that you have shown for years in your support of BJC and in support of your neighbor's faith freedom. You understand and advocate for our shared values every day in your lives and in your witness, and for that I am immensely grateful. I also find hope in dissent. Dissent, after all, is in the Baptist DNA. In the responses, that's right, remember our Baptist dissenters. In the responses to the threats to our freedom, I see people standing up for their neighbors like never before. I see people asking, what can we do about Christian nationalism? You know, we may have grown complacent in the past about the urgency of our need to respond, but now, when our communities need us the very most, to be that witness, to draw on the best of our tradition, our understanding that for freedom Christ has set us free, and that we are to use our freedom not in our own self-interest, but in service to love our neighbor. And that includes our freedom to dissent, to protest, to say this is not right and that we can do something about it. And finally, I find hope and inspiration in listening to how others have responded when their freedom has been stripped away. We at BJC know that religious freedom has been white too long. Over the past few years, we have been intentional about listening to and learning from people of many backgrounds, identities, and experiences. We know that this act of inclusion and intentional listening and learning will lead us to a broader and more complete understanding of freedom itself. We listen to and learn from each other about how freedom has been threatened, how at times we ourselves have been the oppressors, and how we can work to be liberators for our neighbors today. And so I find hope in the conversation we are about to have. And so I welcome to the stage now the Reverend Dr. Mitch Randall, CEO of Good Faith Media, to come and moderate our conversation today. And I invite us all to listen, to learn, and to find hope for our journey to come. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It is good to see you. I hope all is well with you. What a great meal. And are we not thankful for our executive director for BJC, Amanda Tyler? Wow. Thank you so much. Come on up. Well, many of you maybe know my story. My name is Mitch Randall, but I have an indigenous name that was given to me by a Comanche chief from Oklahoma who was a World War II code talker. And that name is Mvskoke, which translates to buffalo. I love my heritage. I love my ancestry and the stories that my ancestors shared with me. And so the opportunity to speak to this distinguished panel today about indigenous voices is a godsend for us. So thank you, Amanda. Thank you for the BJC staff for giving us this opportunity. Well, we've got some very special guests with us today. I want to introduce you to two panelists. First, Dr. Kyle T. Mays is an Afro-Indigenous Saginaw Chippewa writer, scholar of U.S. history, urban studies, race relations, and contemporary popular culture. And Mariah Humphries is a Muscogee Nation citizen, writer, educator, and director of content and communications for Be the Bridge. Now, unfortunately, Dr. Winslow Nosey is not going to able to be with us today. And Dr. Nosey is the former chairman of the San Carlos Apache tribe and the leader of the fight to save Oak Flat. And we're going to talk more about that later in our presentation. But we want to get straight to our conversation. So my first question is for you, Dr. Mays. Prior to 1492, when Columbus landed near what is now called the Bahamas, North America was filled with thriving communities, while many, unfortunately, have the misnomer that the indigenous people of North America were one step above the Neanderthals. I mean, we were called savages after all. Can you describe what life was like for the indigenous peoples before the start of colonialization?
Thank you. Great question, a very complicated question, and I'll try to keep it simple to the point, and I just have my notes on my laptop to be able to do so. All right, so at the beginning of the Crusades in 1095, which is always a very strange thing to say, 1095, Pope Urban II issued the papal bull Terra Nullius, which was a decree declaring that European rulers had the ability to discover and seize the lands of non-Christians. Now think about that. Of course, this is about the history of the Moors, etc., but as early as that, during the Crusades, that really set the stage for taking over lands of non-Europeans and also non-Christians as well. And there's a fantastic book called Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, and when I first read it, he initially talked about the religious issues as a formation of understanding racism, like these early forms of ethnic issues as the foundation of modern society as well. So in 1452, Pope Nicholas V extended the policy through the papal bull Romans Pontifex and declared war against all non-Christians in the world and argued that their territory should be conquered. And of course, per the question per Alexander VI on May 4, 1493, that is my birthday, so terrible day for indigenous peoples, but a wonderful day for me, contributed significantly to the conquest of the Americas. And it allows Spain exclusive right to the lands discovered by Columbus. You can't discover something when people are already there. And it established a delineation of line of 300 miles west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. Spain had exclusive right to acquire territorial possessions, and Portuguese on the other side. Now the question, of course, is what gave them the right to do so? Of course, they didn't have a right, they just made this up arbitrarily. But as I'll show a little bit later, making things up arbitrarily is a function of how dispossession works against indigenous peoples, poor peoples, etc. At its basis, the doctrine of discovery argues that Christians have the right to conquer, seize, and occupy any lands of non-Christians at their discretion. This is what we call today settler colonialism. Now, settler colonialism is a fancy term that has now been a part, it's increasingly mainstream, but it's really just to say this, that non-indigenous peoples come to a particular land, occupy the land, and then they then take and seize and appropriate land of indigenous peoples. Now, another key part of that is the narratives and stories told. So, telling stories about the so-called savagery of indigenous peoples in the U.S., right? That's one particular way. Or the issue of mascots, which is still prevalent today in U.S. society, right? Or other examples of settler colonialism in the world. Zimbabwe, when the IMF or the World Bank say, hey, you have to restructure your economy, we'll give you this loan, but you have to, the land that you took from the European occupiers of your land, we'll give you loans, but you have to return that farmland, right? That is clearly an example, a very contemporary example of settler colonialism. And the key part of settler colonialism is that it persists well into the present. The McGirt decision, which I'm not an expert on at all, but the Supreme Court just ruled on, was it yesterday? Yes. Yesterday, right? Is an example of how settler colonialism works. And so I'll say two more things. So the basis of Western expansion in the U.S. is based on the doctrine of discovery. So in Johnson versus McIntosh of 1823, Chief Justice John Marshall declared the majority opinion that Christian European nations, and he said, quote, the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country is to leave the country a wilderness. To govern them as a distinct people is impossible because they were as brave and as high-spirited as they were fierce. And he goes on to say, discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy, either by purchase or by conquest, and gave us also a right to such a degree of sovereignty as the circumstances of the people would allow them to exercise. So fundamentally, it's about conquering land and people, and it gives Christians the right to do so. This remains a fundamental ideology and political practice in society today in a variety of ways. So I'm glad the BJC is doing this sort of work to challenge that. And so how does issues manifest destiny exist today? I live in downtown Los Angeles, that's close to Skid Row if you've ever been to LA. So it exists in many ways, a displacement of people in urban areas, various forms of gentrification. So if you ever grew up in an urban area and you return back to the area and they change the name of the neighborhood, that's a classic sign of settler colonialism and contemporary manifestation of dispossession.
So I'm glad you brought up doctrine of discovery, and that was a papal bull issued in 1493 by Pope Paul VI. So Mariah, how did that papal bull, the idea, as Dr. Mays laid it out for us, this idea of doctrine of discovery, how did that play a role in the genocide of the indigenous peoples of North America?
I love what Dr. Mays said, and I think it leads right into this all as a mindset, right? I think most people don't just jump into, this is mine, this is not yours, unless we have some sort of justification in our mind, like why this has to happen. And that's what happened here. And as genocide has occurred to Native people here in North America, Canada as well, we have to think about mentally what got us there. And one of the things that is so often overlooked is the narrative that we have all been taught. We've all sat in the same historical classes, and so we have kind of a basic foundation of what we learned in elementary, middle, and high school, and perhaps college as well. But one of the things that so often is not discussed is the fact that the narrative to justify genocide for Native Americans, it means that the Native American has to shift in order to justify why we're coming in and stealing land, violence, killing, genocide. And so as we have this land not discovered, we enter this time of, here are these people that are foreign here, even though we're actually from here, right? These unknown people. And we have to become the issue in order to justify pushing Christianity on the people here, assimilation, civilization, which is a completely different topic because that is, we had communities, we had establishments, and just as a FYI. But I think one of the things that we so often is we just forget that we have to justify our actions, and so we became heathens in order to justify Christianity. And it wasn't just Christianity in the form of, okay, so who is Jesus in this community? How am I saying Jesus played out in this community? How can Christianity be fully in this moment, in this people, right? It was, no, whatever you're doing is absolutely incorrect. You have to change the way you dress, the way you talk, who you associate with, where you live. And we are essentially given, not we in general, we're essentially given a green light at some point to kill and destroy. Government gave a green light. And it was really, hey, if Native Americans are in the way, remove. Because we're justified to be here, because we had a mindset that they were heathens, savages, which is still in official documentation, by the way. And we had to justify, so therefore we had to become the issue. And we had to shift. The narrative towards us had to shift to be able to justify the actions. And I think that's important to realize that I think for the most part, Native Americans, we're kind of like going on our way, right? Like we're people, we're in regions, we have this way of life, and then all of a sudden, we're the ones who are suppressed, we're the ones who are oppressed, and we're the ones who are removed, we're the ones who are killed, and we're the ones who disappear, language, culture, etc. And it's all because we had to become the issue in order for someone to quite literally put a stake in the ground and say, no, this is now mine, because you're the enemy. And so I need to be justified in that action, so that's why this all happens. So it's a mind shift, it's a shift of mind in the people who were the oppressors rather than the ones who were oppressed. And I think we had that shifted incorrectly. We had that shared incorrectly in our classrooms and in our thinking in general. Even when we go in to other spaces today, it's still the mindset of, okay, how is God already working here? And how is God already, we're all created in the image of God, right? The likeness of God, and we're all called good. So there's not this one vein of likeness. We're all created in the likeness. And that's where we really messed up at the very beginning of this time in this country, was the mindset that you have to be something that we want you to be. And we're justifying that because we want what you have, and because we just feel like we can come in and do that. It's a mentality that has to be shifted, even today.
And talking about pre-colonialization and colonialization here in North America, that is the original genocide of the indigenous peoples here in this land. But it did not stop there. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 did not cease the oppression, the marginalization, oppression, and genocide of Native peoples. So the second wave of genocide began with Western expansionism after the creation of the United States of America. So Dr. Mays, you mentioned manifest destiny. What role, well, first of all, define manifest destiny for us, and what role did that play in the United States as lands continued to be taken from indigenous people, and indigenous people were continued to be murdered in the name of advancement and religion?
Yeah, so in a very short amount of time, really by the 1870s, 1880, probably 1887, you had billions of acres that were expropriated by the United States government. And of course, one might say there were treaties signed, of course, but we know now that the United States has violated every single treaty they've ever made with Native peoples. And so when we talk about land is a fundamental point. So the whole notion of manifest destiny is simply this, that it was their God-given right? So they're invoking God here to take over lands from indigenous peoples. I mean, I don't know what God said that to them. I've always been curious what God would say that to them, to just go and conquer other people. But that was the ideology behind it, that it is our right, and then it became law, right? It became a whole ideology in law and in practice. It is certainly codified in law today, as I mentioned, McIntosh versus Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. And so the violence that occurred because of manifest destiny it's a central part of how we should also understand U.S. democracy, right? So when we talk about U.S. democracy, also the enslavement of people of African descent as well. When we talk about U.S. democracy, it's fundamentally about manifest destiny, because colonialism for us has not ended at all. And I want to re-emphasize that point. Colonialism for us has not ended at all. We're a separate nation, sovereign people, et cetera, but we're still living under an occupied territory. And it's difficult for some people to accept that. And so a question, I'm not asking anyone to answer this, but what would it look like for indigenous peoples, one, the United States government to honor the treaties, to actually honor what they said that they were gonna do, and two, returning land to people? Because it's the shift in mindset, as Mariah said, but it's also about land, right? A fundamental part. And it's a difficult question, but if we don't ask the difficult questions, we're not really gonna fundamentally change anything.
Yeah. And Mariah, you mentioned assimilation a moment ago. And recently, the United States Department of Interior released volume 1 of a report examining Indian boarding schools in this country. After the outcry of mass graves being discovered in Canada a few years ago, the United States began to study its own history regarding the assimilation of indigenous children. And this is very personal to me because my great-grandmother and her sister were residents in one of these schools. Can you explain the history of the boarding schools and how justice can be served today in what we discover about these schools?
I think it's a really good question, and it's historical and it's also relevant today. And I think one of the things that you discover through our conversation today is so many of the current issues that we still face in Native America are very much historical, and it just continues through just the face changes and how they go about suppressing and oppressing shifts, but it's still the same mindset. And please jump in at any time during this one. Deb Haaland, by the way, who's Laguna Pueblo Secretary of Interior, I think that only happened because there was actual representation of Native Americans in a position that could take this on, and which is why it's so important, which is not any of our questions, but representation is so important because we do have somebody in place who has that lived experience. Also, my grandmother was in a boarding school, and so Deb's family also experienced that. And so that is, when you have that experience, you're able to lift that voice up a little bit more. And so she has put forward this initiative. And volume 1, it's a lengthy document, by the way. We're not talking about like font 14 with a bunch of images. This thing is margin to margin, and it is heavy. It is mentally heavy, emotionally heavy, spiritually heavy. Because in the boarding schools, so many of the foundational people involved with it were Christians. And that is hard to accept as a Native American Christian. And I think it's hard to talk about as a Christian country. And I think that is something that I'm so proud of, that we have somebody in place who is taking that on. I'm a little irritated that Canada took this on first. Just for reasons, but I'm glad that we're touching on this, and we had so much information and this is a thick document, and it's only the first volume. And I think it's very important for you to go look that up and take a look at it heavily and deeply. But between 1869 and the 1960s, really, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were removed from their homes. We're not talking about boarding school for the wealthy, right? We're not talking about, hey, we're going to send our kid off to boarding school because little Johnny is getting in trouble, and so we're going to go send him off to do whatever. These are children, and if you have, school-age children, elementary and younger to toddlers to infants, removed from your homes forcibly in most cases, and placed into sometimes other, we're very much about invisible borders, but for the sake of today, placed in other states, other regions. And we have 574 federally recognized tribes with several more who just are not federally recognized. That's hundreds of cultures and languages and communities. And so we're not this monolith. And so when you put Native children with other Native children who are of a different tribal nation, they don't speak the same language. They don't have the same culture. They don't know, it's not like being in the same neighborhood where you all play at the same playground. You're around people that you have no idea who you are. The only thing you have in common is who you are as a Native American. And so we had this Indian Civilization Act. We've got a really good job of bringing up the acts and justifying violence against Native Americans throughout the country.
That is why it is so frightening today in recent decisions about public funding going to private sectarian schools, because the indigenous people, they know that story and they see how it ends.
Yes.
Religion is always used as a tool for oppression when it is supported by government dollars. And like our families experienced, religion was used to assimilate them, not to a place of faith, but to a place of colonialization. So that's why that is so important for us even today to know about these stories of these boarding schools so we do not repeat the same mistakes today, just in a new era. Now, Mariah, I've got another question for you that is very important. Let's talk about some of the contemporary issues today. We're going to talk a little bit about Oak Flat here in just a moment. But some of the contemporary issues concerning the indigenous people are from Standing Rock to missing and murdered indigenous women to the Supreme Court decision recently on Magritte, Oklahoma. There are numerous issues playing out today. Can you speak to one of those? What are the issues for indigenous peoples today that we need to know about?
There are a lot, but I do want to talk about MMIW. It's very important for me to talk about that. I do want to give it a little bit of a disclaimer because some of the content I'm going to share is sexual violence content. So just so you know, if you have experienced that, I'm going to be talking about that. And when it comes to Native American women, I like to use this quote by Dr. Audra Simpson. She's a Mohawk. And she says in her book, Mohawk Interrupt Us, which is an amazing book, by the way, Native women have been deemed killable, able to be raped without repercussion, expendable. And historically, our Native female body, and I will say historically the Black female body in our country, have been deemed dispensable. And the violence against our bodies have been justified. They haven't, they're not justified, but they've been justified because there's this hypersexuality when our bodies are viewed. And so we have an issue today, we have a crisis today that we're just now starting to talk about with missing and murdered indigenous women. So it's MMIW. And May 5th is a day of recognizing that. There are a lot of stats around this that are pretty hard to accept, and they're pretty intense. And I want to share a few of those because they're important and they're factual and they're hard to hear. We are 2.5 times more likely to experience sexual assault and rape than any other ethnic group in the US. So think about that. 84% of us, which is 4 out of 5, I looked that up. If you guys are statisticians and that's wrong, like, don't come for me, I just looked that up. Have experienced violence, okay, in our lifetime. 56 have experienced sexual violence, okay? And over 90% have experienced violence at the hands of a non-tribal member. That alone leads into so many other issues. It leads into issues where Standing Rock comes into play. It leads into issues with your pipelines. It leads into issues with your Violence Against Women's Act, where every time it's reauthorized, we have to fight to have Native American included in the act because of that one statistic of violence against our bodies by a non-tribal member. And there is a protection, a legal protection in so many cases for the non-tribal perpetrator over the victim if you're Native American. And sometimes that's on tribal land, sometimes it's not. It's against Native American women. And murder is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women. And on some Native land, we are 10 times more likely to be murdered. And that is a very high statistic group to think about. And those are all being done not by the US government, those are all being done by Native Americans digging into these. We're becoming doctors and sociologists and lawyers, and so we can take on these conversations to be able to represent our people. And so these are really important things to think about because they lead in from the historical stuff that we've been talking about. And I think that it's tragic, and it should make us uncomfortable. Like if you're totally comfortable hearing all these stats, you're concerning me. So like we should all be uncomfortable with that. But MMIW really leads into so many other things that are legal, and then land and body, and it's tragic, but it is something that we are facing today.
Well, Dr. Mays, Mariah, thank you so much for being with us today. It was a joy hearing from you. We will continue to keep our voices for faith freedom alive, and I am so glad that you are here today to amplify the Indigenous voice. Would you give them a round of applause? Thank you. One of the issues that the BJC is currently working on is to save Oak Flat. Oak Flat is tribal lands, Apache lands in the state of Arizona. And the federal government is currently trying to sell that land to a foreign mining company. This issue is about religious freedom for all. It's about environmentalism. It's about what we've talked about here today in colonialization. It has all these facets to it. And I am so thankful that the BJC is fighting for these people. Dr. Wendell Nosey said this about Oak Flat. Oak Flat is the beginning of our being, our identity. Oak Flat is where the Creator made us and gave us this land. This is the centerpiece that makes up everything that we are. If the Apaches, if they are forced to give up their land, then all of us are in jeopardy of losing something. This is an important issue, and I am thankful the BJC is standing up against such treachery.